All right, let's dive deep inside the brain, shall we? We're heading to a tiny, really ancient region called the hypothalamus. Now, this little spot controls our most basic survival instincts, hunger, thirst, sleep. But here's the kicker. It's also the command center for one of our most complex and, let's be honest, private behaviors, sex. So how does this one tiny part of the brain hold so much power over us? Let's find out. So here's where we're headed. We're going to start with that central control system, the hypothalamus. Then we'll see how scientists started to decode male sexual behavior. From there, we'll look at the very different blueprint for females. We'll also zoom out and explore related feelings, things like love and even aggression. We'll touch on what happens when this whole system changes, with age or medication. And we'll finish up by asking the big question: how much of this is hardwired and how much is up to us?
Okay, so let's kick things off with a pretty fundamental contradiction. We all know sex is a universal biological drive. It's absolutely essential for the survival of our species. But that brings up a really interesting question. Why are we so weird about it? Seriously, we'll talk about almost anything else, but for most people, the details of their sex lives are completely off limits. And this privacy, historically, has created this huge blind spot in our understanding of what makes people tick. And that's why Alfred Kinsey's surveys back in the 1950s were such a bombshell. When his data came out and revealed that a full 50% of married men had had extramarital affairs, people were absolutely shocked. It was like he ripped the curtain back on what was actually going on versus what society just pretended was happening. So where does all this powerful, private behavior come from? Well, the biological key is buried deep inside our brains, in that tiny structure we mentioned, the hypothalamus. It's small, yeah, but it's the mighty command center where our most primal urges get cooked up and regulated. Now, to figure out what the hypothalamus was actually doing, scientists couldn't just, put human volunteers in an MRI and ask them to perform. Well, not at first anyway. So the whole investigation had to start somewhere else, with animal models. And that's where they got their first crucial clues. And it started right here. You gotta love it. The first clues came from grad students spending countless tedious hours watching rats in a box. They were timing everything, measuring all these very specific things. It probably didn't feel very glamorous, but all that painstaking work led to this absolutely monumental discovery. Turns out, a student was looking through some old brain slides, and they noticed something that nobody had seen before. A specific little cluster of cells in the hypothalamus was always consistently bigger in male rats than in female rats. They gave it a name, the sexually dimorphic nucleus, or SDN for short. And wow, this image really brings that discovery to life. You don't need a PhD in neuroscience to see what's going on here. The SDN in the male brain on the bottom is just obviously larger than the one in the female brain on top. And that physical difference, it's literally sculpted by hormones like testosterone way back in early development. So finding the SDN was the key. It lets scientists finally map out this clear chain of command. A signal kicks off in the SDN, it gets relayed through the midbrain, and then boom, it activates specific neurons down in the spinal cord that control the physical mechanics of the male sexual response. Okay, so if the SDN is the big deal for males, what's the story with females? Does their sexual behavior come from the same place, just a smaller version? Well, the investigation revealed it's not that simple. It's a completely different, parallel system.
And it turns out it's not about a smaller version of the same thing at all. The female brain depends on a totally different area called the ventromedial nucleus, or VMN. And this region is super sensitive to female hormones like estrogen and progesterone, and it's what governs those receptive behaviors. So you've got two different nuclei tuned to two totally different hormonal cocktails.
But you have to ask, does any of this rat research apply to humans? Well, a rare condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia gives us a really compelling clue. It causes developing female fetuses to be exposed to much higher levels of male hormones. Now, most of these women grow up to be heterosexual, but studies have found that as a group, there's a statistically higher rate of homosexual interest and activity. It's a huge hint that, just like in rats, our early hormone exposure plays a major role in wiring our brains.
But the hypothalamus isn't just a one-trick pony managing the mechanics of sex. Nope, its influence spreads out to a whole suite of related behaviors. Everything from the deep emotional bonds of love to the raw instinctual drive of aggression.
This is one of my favorite examples. Just look at the difference between these two little critters. The prairie vole is monogamous, super social. The meadow vole, solitary and promiscuous. What's the difference? It boils down to the brain's receptors for a bonding hormone called vasopressin. A tiny shift in brain chemistry creates a completely different social world. It's incredible.
And if you zoom all the way out, on the grandest scale, sex is really about survival. The whole reason for all this complex brain wiring is to keep our genes diverse. And the Tasmanian devil gives us this tragic, real-world example of what happens when that diversity disappears. Their population is so genetically similar that a bizarre, contagious cancer can literally spread from one animal to another through a bite, and it's threatening to wipe them all out.
So we've got this intricate, hormone-fueled system running the show. But it's not set in stone. It changes over a lifetime, and it can be seriously affected by external things, like medications we take. I mean, just look at aging. It's a natural process, but it involves a major drop in hormones. For men, free testosterone levels can fall by nearly half between the ages of 30 and 70, and that directly affects those testosterone-sensitive neurons we've been talking about in the hypothalamus, often leading to changes in sexual function.
And a lot of common medications can really throw a wrench in the works. SSRI antidepressants like Prozac can mess with the system in up to 40% of men. Opioids? They directly block those key neurons in the hypothalamus. But then you have drugs like Viagra, which work in a clever way by bypassing some of the hormonal signals and acting directly on blood vessels to help overcome some of these issues.
After hearing all this, it's pretty easy to start feeling like we're just biological robots, just carrying out the ancient commands of our brain chemistry. But the conclusion from the actual science is so much more empowering than that.
And this quote from our source material just nails it. While the hypothalamus lays the groundwork for our drives, we are not its puppets, because we have another, much newer, much more evolved part of our brain that gets a major vote.
And this is really the bottom line. The hypothalamus provides the raw impulse, the basic machinery. But our cerebral cortex, the part responsible for learning, thought, memory, culture, it's in a constant conversation with that primal part of the brain. The cortex can interpret, it can guide, and it can even override those basic signals. And that leaves us with this final thought to chew on. Our neurochemistry, our hormones, that's the blueprint for our behavior. But our experiences, our choices, our culture, and our own consciousness, that's the architect, building the unique, complex structure of who we are right on top of that foundation. Thanks for joining me.